The news, by its very nature, is bound to oversample bad things and neglect good things. The agenda, pejoratively called wokeism, but it's a convenient term, just devours every other issue, and it's torn apart one organization after another. These are kind of betrayals of ideas originally associated with the left that, strangely enough, have been steamrollered by the critical social justice wokist trends.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Steven Pinker's a professor of psychology at Harvard University and the author of several books very relevant to our audience. And most recently, Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, and Why It Matters. Before that, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress. And before that, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And Steven, you're very welcome to the podcast. Delighted to have you. And isn't there a new book due this year in 2025?
There will be in September. It's called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, ... Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life. I'll leave that.
Well, I can't wait for that. And welcome to the Saving the World from Bad Ideas podcast. We figured that the bad idea you could be saving the world from could be there's no such thing as progress. I know this is something you've written and spoken about a lot. In particular, I remember a quote from you asking the question rhetorically, why is it that progressives hate progress? And that really sort of stuck with me. And can you give us a definition of what progress is in your estimation?
Yeah, I would identify it with improvements in human flourishing, where human flourishing would include the qualities that all of us strive for individually, like health, longevity, education, happiness, safety, but also happen to be the prerequisites to everything else. You know, if you're not alive, you're not having this conversation about what human progress is. If you're starving, if you're on your deathbed, if you're cowering in fear of being murdered. So just the basic prerequisites to human life, including the kind of civilized human life that allows you to have this conversation to begin with. All of those are values, and if they have increased over time, that would be progress.
And this is what you believe has indeed been happening if you measure it empirically, is that right? Because obviously
Yes.
Everyone thinks everything's getting worse when you look at the news. It's always bad news and there's terrible things happening every single day. And we have a sort of bias towards the negative, I suppose, as a result of that. But if you look at it empirically, and you've done this in some of your books, then progress is real in across a number of issues?
Yes, although not everywhere all the time. That would be a miracle, and progress is certainly not a miracle. It does comprise some obvious facts, such as that for most of human history and prehistory, life expectancy at birth was about 30. About a third of children died before reaching adulthood. Now it's in the developed world, it's more than 80. In the world as a whole, it's 70. So not only do we have extra life, we have an extra life. It's as if we were granted two lives by historical standards. Another example is, for example, extreme poverty, where 200 years ago, by current standards, one can say that 90% of humanity lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 9%. These are big, significant accomplishments. We're also safer. Most humans are literate. That is, again, an amazing accomplishment, given that we're born illiterate. And so it doesn't happen everywhere. There's still an awful lot of extreme poverty. If it's 9% of humanity, 9% of 8 billion people is still an awful lot of poor people. And it sets a target or a goal of eliminating it further. But it also indicates that it's not impossible. That is, if we've gone from 90% to 9%, well, we could go to 6%, and that would be good, and 5% would be even better, and so on. And you're right that the To many people, it sounds radical. People say it's Pollyannish, it's Panglossian, it's rose-colored glasses. But these are kind of basic facts which are totally consistent with even qualitative indicators of what life used to be like. People would have large families of 9 kids, and 3 or 4 of them would die before childbirth. That's very common in biographies of even wealthy people through the 19th and early 20th century. Uh, None of this should be a shock when you actually read some history. It comes as a shock, even though it shouldn't, partly because it's just the way that the news inherently distorts our understanding of reality. And by that, I don't mean that there's a left-wing bias or even a right-wing bias or or chasing after eyeballs and clicks. I mean, those do exist, but the news, by its very nature, is bound to oversample bad things and neglect good things, simply because by reporting events, something that happens all of a sudden is probably going to be bad. Something that is good either consists of something that didn't happen, like there's no war, there was no terrorist attack, there was no famine, or things that build up gradually, a few percentage points a year, possibly even compounding, that never take place rapidly enough to generate a headline. And so you never read, to use an example from Max Roser, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, even though when it happens, every day for 30 years, it transforms the world, but you never learn about it from the news. Only the view from data can even tell you or remind you that this has been happening.
What's the drivers of progress? I mean, is it a sort of endogenous process that happens almost by accident? Because I think there's probably two different views of this. Maybe from the kind of the progressives, if you like, or the liberals or the left or something, it would be, progress results as the sort of from struggle, like civil rights struggles or struggles of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie or the capitalists or something. Whereas maybe on the right, progress could happen through innovation, technological innovation, and that kind of thing. What in your view is the driver of progress, assuming that progress is real, as the stats seem to show?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there are struggles, but very often it is a combination of knowledge. That is, nature doesn't care about our well-being. The universe has no benevolent interest in us. And so things naturally go wrong. The natural state of humanity is poverty because refrigerators don't parachute from the sky. Someone has to invent them and make them. Um, Food doesn't just fall like heaven from like manna from heaven. There's not enough fruiting trees to feed all of humanity. We've got to grow the stuff, and when we grow it, bugs and rodents eat it, and lots of stuff can go wrong. And everyone would rather that our harvests not get eaten by locusts, and everyone would rather that we have shelter and so on. But it takes knowledge to figure out how to do it. So knowledge, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, but also our knowledge and our efforts have to be applied with the goal of making people better off. Going back to our definition of progress from the beginning of the conversation, that is, you could imagine, and sometimes it happens that knowledge and technology just get applied to more and more lethal weapons, or to aggrandizing some empire, or indulging some imperial leader. When that happens, knowledge alone isn't going to make us all better off. So that's the convergence of knowing more and applying it to humanistic goals. I kind of loosely call these the ideals of the Enlightenment, the valorization of human well-being as the ultimate moral good, and the conviction that if we learn more about how the world works, we, in practice, can improve human well-being.
Right. And so it used to be progressives who hated progress. And now I'm wondering whether it's instead of being the left, it's now the right, because an anti-progress mindset seems to me very much at the center of the MAGA movement and the Trump philosophy, in the sense that there's an assumption, I guess, for if you're going to make America great again, then things were better in the past. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of it. It's about turning the clock back. It's about smashing institutions that have, somehow gone rotten. And, and at the center, it's a narrative of decline, I suppose. And that's the very opposite, the very antithesis of progress. So Do you agree with that? And if so, where do you think it's come from?
Yes, certainly that was very much true of Trump's first term, where his inaugural address was back in 2017 was dark and dystopian, sometimes called the American Carnage speech. Something bizarre has happened with Trump the second time around, and as you and I are speaking, it's only it's only been in existence for a couple of weeks, but it's an odd combination between, uh, as you correctly put it, the reactionary mindset, beginning with the slogan "Make America Great Again," like it used to be, it no longer is. That's a backward-looking a mindset, bolstered this time around with some certain intellectuals of the neo-reactionary and integralist and Christian nationalist and national conservative movements. So actually, this time around has some eggheads behind him, some boffins, and they, I think, kind of ignorant of a lot of history, kind of do want to turn back the clock. And wasn't it great when the church gave us rock solid moral values? And so there is a deeply reactionary, and reactionary in the literal sense of wanting to turn the clock back, not just as an epithet. At the same time, there's an odd coalition of techno optimists who believe that innovation will make us better. Uh, some observers in the United States expect that this coalition can't last. And in fact, there already is a pretty vicious fight between Steve Bannon, who represents carried over from the first term, who kind of represents the reactionaries, and Elon Musk, who represents the techno bros.
Yeah, and at the heart of it seems also to be authoritarianism. Ultimately, I mean, I don't know. I can't decide really whether they want to make Trump dictator, in whether they're just trolling us when they say that, or whether they're serious about it. A lot of the time, Trump often is serious about things that he says, even if they are sort of floated in a kind of jokey way. And I'd be more relaxed about it perhaps if he hadn't denied the result of the 2020 election and hadn't literally sent his supporters to try and overthrow the government. I mean, these are not things that he's just said on X or Twitter. These are things that actually happened in reality and were, really, really do point in a very worrying direction in terms of the authoritarian impulses behind this movement. So, what's your reading of that and the kind of international context of the kind of far right resurgence?
Deeply concerned, and this is, I guess, proof that I am not an optimist in the general sense. I don't think in the short term that things are looking good at all, because a number of the forces that at least I have argued are responsible for our progress are directly in the crosshairs of this movement, such as international norms and agreements and mechanisms. I think it really is good that you don't have nations, states competing for national glory. The idea that national borders are grandfathered in and then sovereignty is not constantly up for negotiation, instead of disputing what territory should belong to which country, which is the major cause of wars up to the Second World War. Let's just freeze the borders on the map. If countries voluntarily want to split apart, like Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union, they Czechoslovakia, and no one can stop them. But conquest is off the table, annexation is off the table. That's been challenged by well, first, obviously, by Putin actually literally invading Ukraine. That's the biggest breach. Xi Jinping rattling his saber about invading Taiwan, and then Trump, instead of trying to reinforce the norm, is picking away at it, even if he's trolling and making jokes about annexing Canada and Greenland and Panama Canal Zone. The thing about norms is they're often maintained because everyone believes that they're being maintained. And when you start to question them, to joke about them, it kind of makes it a live option that they could unravel or be removed. So that is concerning. The withdrawal of the United States from international organizations, which provide a A channel of cooperation and friendship, a means of resolving disputes short of warfare. It's upsetting that those are being undermined, and all of the violations of constitutional um, guardrails that were designed during the Enlightenment to prevent a democracy in the United States from ever becoming a dictatorship, by meaning that whoever is presiding, literally the president, doesn't get to call the shots according to his whims, but it has to be reviewed by other branches of government, and that is being undermined by the executive orders, by firing the inspectors. Uh, there's a lot. The contempt for science in the choice of some of the um, cabinet secretaries, most flamboyantly Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is just out to lunch when it comes to the public health and science and agriculture. So yeah, these are the question is, will the whole thing just have such a collision with reality that it will fissure, it will produce chaos that will lead to a reaction? It's only been a few weeks in, so we don't know.
Fancy making a prediction?
Oh, my predictions about what would happen with the Trump phenomenon have been so repeatedly disconfirmed that I'm wary. I mean, back in 2015, I thought that his candidacy was a joke, that there's just no way, that it was a stunt. There's no way he could ever get the nomination, let alone the presidency. Now he's gotten it twice. So what do I know?
Well, likewise, I used to think that at least he wasn't a warmonger, and that's what maybe distinguishes him from the 1930s era capital F fascist, which was a very militaristic movement. There was brown shirts. It was all very well organized at the level of sort of street warfare, and but whereas the MAGA movement doesn't seem to have that. And Trump, if anything, was often warning about we shouldn't have the Third World War, and I want to end wars, and I want to pull out of ultimately pull out of Ukraine, I guess, and other Afghanistan as well back in the 2016 election. So that seems to be going, though. I think, if anything, there is a sort of new era of militarism, perhaps. If you don't talk about invading other countries and annexing Canada, unless you're prepared to at least envisage. And I think he's been saying about it wiping out Iran, emptying the whole population of the Gaza Strip.
He's always, I mean, just yesterday, we have another territory that he's hoping, or at least making jokes about annexing. So yeah, so you and I in our conversation have already unearthed all of these contradictions, and part of the phenomenon, and this happens when you have kind of charismatic strongman as opposed to a real movement, is that he himself is deliberately capricious. He loves chaos. Uh, he's mercurial. I think in his own psyche, it's all about his own greatness, glory, preeminence, ego, and so combined with these ideas that you and I have identified, there's also the man himself with all of his personality oddities.
I mean, does any of this run counter to the narratives that you've pointed out in your books? I mean, thinking of the better angels, perhaps. And I think you've talked about this before, but I'm just interested to develop it a bit. I'm persuaded that overall violence has declined in society, certainly over longish time periods. But we now have the capacity, obviously, with nuclear weapons to wipe out the whole of civilization, and in fact, pretty much the whole of the biosphere in fairly short order. It would take a matter of a few hours actually in terms of the warfare that could unleash that level of destruction. And I've actually written a book about this, which is coming out in a few months, so it's something I've looked into in really great detail about nuclear winter. And and also I make the argument actually that we've got to abolish nuclear weapons, that there's no alternative ultimately to getting to zero if civilization is to survive long term. And so we may have fewer wars, but the capacity of our weapons to wreak destruction has obviously reached unparalleled highs with thermonuclear weapons.
No, it's an argument that I'm sympathetic to, and when you have a distribution of catastrophes with that thick tail, that is, events that are unlikely but not astronomically unlikely and catastrophic in their destruction. It doesn't even make sense to, in fact, you cannot even mathematically sum up the overall risk in a single number. You've really got to kind of deal with them separately. So yes, there are fewer wars. There have gotten less destructive over the last 80 years or so, but there is the non-negligible probability of a truly catastrophic war. And in Better Angels, I actually discussed a movement that now does seem a little quaint. I'm glad you're reviving it, of global zero, of abolishing, just abolishing them altogether, which at the time I wrote Better Angels had some odd plausibility to it, because there had recently been a statement by four of the hawkiest Cold War hawks, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, William Perry, and who's the fourth? Oh, George Shultz. No, Perry was not a hawk, but these were, hard-headed, cold realists, and they were calling for all nuclear weapons to be abolished, as Ronald Reagan had, to much derision during his presidency. Obama, shortly after he was nominated, expressed some sympathy toward it, and this was one of the reasons he got the Nobel Peace Prize. And even at the time, again, this seems like ancient history, even though you and I lived through it. But Medvedev in Russia expressed some sympathy. So it was actually, it wasn't highly likely, but it was certainly a live option back in 2008, 2009. That does seem like a long time ago, but it doesn't mean that it can't come back. And there are well, I'm sure you have them worked out in your book, where a lot of the suspicions that this is impossible, you can't uninvent them, it's romantic, it's utopian, I think may not be valid, at least may not be valid forever. And so this is something that we should aspire to in the long run. In the shorter run, just making the systems more secure, the lines of communication more open and transparent, kind of the preconditions to pushing the probability as low as possible. Maybe thinking of a roadmap. Again, I'm sure you've worked this out. Like, is there a intermediate ground where each country has a few dozen, just for deterrence, with a no first use pledge? I'm not sure how you work it out, but I think we should think these thoughts. I think I agree with you that this deserves serious consideration.
Well, and the posture of the United States is particularly worrying, actually. You have presidential sole authority. So the president can literally press the button and nobody else in the chain of command is empowered to refuse an order. At the same time as you've got launch on warning postures. So you have to get the ICBMs out of their silos and into the air on a trajectory which can't be stopped or reversed or changed once they're out, when all you've got in terms of incoming is blips on a radar screen, which you are supposed to believe. And there's been very close, I'm sure you know, very close shaves with inadvertent nuclear war because of things going wrong and wrong disk being put into computers and stuff like that. So it's the US actually is particularly egregious in terms of its nuclear posture right now.
No, I agree, and I think it's actually astonishing that literally the end of the world is not an issue. In our recent elections, in most of the commentary, including the commentary coming out the left, and where I think the left has lost sight of some of what used to be its core issues. An example being, there's an organization that I used to support that advocated toward abolition. They got, like so many institutions in the last few years, all of a sudden pivoted toward anti-racism, and where they decided their priority was to emphasize how the racial inequities and the hidden racism behind this movement and that movement. It's like, hey, you guys are just trying to save the world. And it brought to mind, in a kind of mordant joke, I don't know if you're familiar with the song from Tom Lehrer from the 1960s, "We will all go together when we go." So I'm going to encourage all of you, including you, Mark, if you're not familiar with it, when we stop this conversation, go to YouTube and type in "We'll all go together when we go." It was black humor, like a lot of Tom Lehrer, mordantly witty, but it also speaks to this bizarre turn that this organization took toward worrying about racial inequality when the issue is like the end of humanity. So, anyway, I'm going to encourage all the listeners to check that out.
Yeah, no, and in fact, that's one of the things I think we have to do very differently in terms of organizing a movement to get to the abolition of nuclear weapons. It has to not be a left-wing hippie peacenik. It has to not be for peace. Actually, peace isn't the issue. The issue
I
is
mean, it is an issue. It's a different. No, I agree. It is another issue. Yes, I agree.
But I mean, I was looking at the website of one of these global zero groups, and it talks about white patriarchy, and there's a whole laundry list of left-wing type woke issues that you have to agree with before you can even get involved in their campaign. And that seems to me to be completely wrong-headed.
So you and I probably have in mind the same organization. And so that's when I at least pulled the plug on my donations. And at the time, I tweeted Tom Lehrer's song as the ultimate refutation of this way of thinking about it.
Well, let's talk, while we're on the subject, let's talk a bit about your own issues with I don't know if I should call it wokery, because that's a pejorative, but you know what I'm talking about. You know, you said it, was it the Harvard Center for Academic Freedom? What was the name of it again?
The Council for Academic Freedom at Harvard, where I and a number of my colleagues founded this organization just about 2 years ago for our mission statement identifies 3 values, and that is academic freedom, um, intellectual diversity, and civil discourse.
Right. I mean, I had experienced this when I was at Cornell as a visiting fellow, and an accusation was made by a person who they identified as trans, I think, and also indigenous, and also as black. And what was really stunning, and I've never forgotten, was that we had several Africans from people from Rwanda and Nigeria and Kenya on this course. It was a global fellowship course, and the Africans kept misgendering, as it was called, this person who claimed because they would say she, and the person was saying, oh no, actually I'm he, and they just couldn't get their heads around it because it's just not part of African culture. And when there was accusations made and it came in front of the student union, and the African fellows went to defend the program and were sent out of the hall because they kept misgendering. So Africans were basically denied the ability to speak on behalf of the program because of the kind of this extraordinary issue.
No, this is I mean, I shouldn't be laughing because it's kind of sad, but this, not only does this happen, but it's ignored at our peril, as we saw in the American election, in which Trump, bizarrely and contrary to the expectations of many people, including me, increased his level of support from African Americans and Hispanics. And it's partly because some of the issues that the left has made sacred, such as a complete denial of biological sex with consequences that many people think defy common sense, like a guy gets convicted of rape, just announces that he changes gender to be a woman and so he can go into a woman's prison, that mediocre male athletes declare that they're women and then sweep away every record competing against biological women in sports. You can make arguments for these, but most people will say they defy common sense, and I think they're right. But also, when it becomes a sacred cause of the left, they'll sacrifice everything else, including women's rights, and in the anecdote you just told, the rights of Africans, and again, ironically enough, diversity, in the sense that not all cultures are going to agree with the latest cause from elite left-wing urban American universities and publications. There is skepticism, which can shade into homophobia in more traditional cultures. But the agenda, pejoratively called wokeism, but it's a convenient term, just devours every other issue, and it's torn apart one organization after another. Global Zero, as you and I have discussed, is one example. But there are others, several humanist organizations, several civil liberties and civil rights organizations are just unfunctional because of partly because of internecine fights. Oh, you're a racist. No, you're a racist. Oh, what you just said was calling this person a racist was even more racist, and they just can't get anything done, or drive out their own supporters. But it's a betrayal of some of the ideals that originally animated um, progressives in the true sense of progress, such as treating everyone as an individual and not categorizing them by their race, uh, having as your main concern the well-being of the poor instead of the well-being of one race or another race. These are kind of betrayals of ideas originally associated with the left that strangely enough have been steamrollered by the critical social justice wokeist uh, uh, trends.
So where are things moving in that in academia? I mean, Trump has wiped the floor with the left on this issue, and it's obviously been a huge wellspring of support. I mean, what was the slogan they used in the election? Kamala is for they, them, and Trump is for he, him, or whatever. And it was, I think I've got that wrong, but it was
Trump is for you.
Trump is for you, yes, and Kamala's for they, them, yeah. And as you say, a lot of young people agreed with that too. And so, if Trump's right on this, is it going to help in the struggle that you've identified for academic freedom, or is it simply going to polarize things further?
So it will polarize things. It will, because it's just so aggressive and coarse and crude. It won't be, it's attacking everything with a sledgehammer, or if you forgive the lapse of taste, kind of a nuclear option for everything. So I think it'll do. Not only will it polarize, I fear, but it will just not solve problems, because it will throw out babies with bathwater. It will overreach. Possibly, if one were an optimist, and I guess this is going to be more proof that I'm despite claims, I am not. One could say that because here's the most positive spin you could put on it, and it is true that the um, critical social justice, critical race, wokeist movement has in many cases been ruthless, just firing people, censoring things, destroying institutions, that you have to meet brute force with brute force. And that some of the rather ham-fisted moves of the Trump administration at least will stop the momentum of this juggernaut. And maybe clear, when the dust settles, it'll clear out space for reasoned, common sense policies. I don't know if I'm that much of an optimist. That's the best that one can hope for. I mean, really what we want is a kind of a return to just kind of normal people arguing defensible policies, learning from successes, trying not to repeat mistakes, seeing problems as problems to be solved rather than enemies to be vanquished. Uh, that kind of sometimes called the normie politics of people with just normal reasoning faculties and humane values.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope that liberals could rediscover liberalism, and it could come from that.
That's exactly right. That is that's the hope. And I mean, the word liberal, of course, itself has many different meanings. But yes, in the most basic sense of classic liberalism, of the Enlightenment, of John Stuart Mill, of human rights, of freedom, of reason, that is what I hope we'll strive for.
I mean, the problem I have, though, with, this is the case with the Trump administration, when you have people who want to, I mean, they're almost a revolutionary movement. They want to destroy institutions. And, how do you fight against a revolutionary movement without looking like a reactionary? Like, you're defending the old order, you're defending the old elitist institutions that seems to be so discredited in the eyes of so many people.
Indeed. And it is a kind of I don't know if it's public relations or leadership, or it is a challenge to frame things so that you preserve what needs to be preserved while not seeing like you're just a tool of the establishment. And there are politicians who've been able to do it. Barack Obama with his hope and change, and he had gave off optimistic vibes. And he said, and I quote this in Enlightenment now, if you had to pick a time to be born and you didn't know who you'd be, you'd pick now. I think that's right. And it is it doesn't mean there isn't more room for improvement, but it does mean that we should take note of how bad things used to be and could be again if we're not careful.
Right. I want to talk a bit about the environmental movement. Without going into my own story in too much detail, I've had a journey where I started off as a very kind of traditional environmentalist, and then I discovered that I was wrong about nuclear and GMOs and things like that, and then became quite critical, and suffered for it. I was an early version of being cancelled, I suppose, by my green friends when I first started writing and talking about it. But the idea behind the work that I'm doing now with colleagues in We Planet and more broadly in the pro-nuclear sort of progressive environmental scene is to sort of construct a new variant of environmentalism, which has been called eco-modernism. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but
yes.
Yeah. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that, whether it's possible to have a rational, empirical environmental movement, or whether such thing is sort of just never going to happen.
No, I think it is. It's certainly desirable. That is to look at environmental harm as a problem to be solved, to be open-minded as what realistically will solve it, to acknowledge that a lot of the harm to the environment has been a regrettable byproduct of developments that have improved a lot of humanity. That is, reducing extreme poverty, enhancing opportunity, that we now have to apply our collective intelligence to getting all the benefits of energy capture and development and without the harms. And that trying to move away from ideas that I think have animated the classic green movement of seeing the almost a quasi-religious view of seeing the earth as sacred, pristine, precious, humans as evil defilers, the tactics being moralization to cast humans as villains and to demonize those who want to capture energy and develop things for the benefit of humanity, to push the clock back to a seeming past paradise again, almost a reactionary movement, and rather to say our environmental problems are utmost seriousness. We have neglected them, but let's figure out how to use our ingenuity to continue to enjoy the benefits of development and energy capture and to valorize human ingenuity, but to try to prevent the planet from overheating, to try to, not to extinguish species, to not to poison our drinking water, and so on. So I've been influenced by Stuart Brand, by Ted Nordhaus. I thought Stuart Brand's book, Whole Earth Discipline, was a good statement of eco-pragmatism or eco-modernism.
Yeah, it was certainly one of the ones that most influenced me as well. And I think the critique that the Stuart and Ted and that we've developed on environmentalism is quite borne out actually by what's happened with RFK Jr. and some of these. A lot of the not the left wing part, but a lot of the kind of crunchy organic alternative health. I mean, that's always been there's been a huge amount of overlap with the traditional environmental movement, which is now somehow with anti-vax and everything, and also I suppose the kind of the conspiracist mindset. It's not so much the government that's out to screw you, but it's the companies. It's big pharma. It's big whatever the companies are, and so that kind of narrative, that political narrative of the left, seems to have become really center to he calls it make America healthy again, right? So it's a riff on MAGA, and that's what's happened to some of the Greens, that they've become far right.
Bizarrely enough, but there we talked about the inherent contradictions of the movement, that the techno optimists are going to inevitably clash with the political reactionaries. Here again, because the Trump administration is so sympathetic to corporations, Uh, and what and farmers, including big agriculture, that RFK Jr.'s attempt to get Americans off, seed oils and processed food is going to collide head on with the farm lobby and the industrial lobby, and corporate lobby. So there's going to be some more chaos there, or at least more internecine fighting. I don't want to have Schadenfreude and just hope that there'll be such internal conflicts that it'll fall apart. But that seems to be a real possibility.
As a psychologist, right? Give me a word of advice for how we can run an environmental movement that fits with human psychology. Like it's very easy to make extremist claims and alarmist claims and emotionally, things which are very emotionally impactful, but not quite right, and to run campaigns on those. How can you run environmental campaigns which are empirically based and moderate and things like that? Is it possible with human psychology?
I think it is possible, and there has been a lot of progress in the environment. I mean, the American air and water is much cleaner than it was 40 years ago. Some species have been rescued from the brink of extinction. More and more protected areas are being set aside, so there have been progress. Certainly is possible. I think part of it is just to avoid unnecessary polarization. People do line up into tribes, and research shows you give people this exact same policy, and you say this comes from your favorite right-wing politician or your detested left-wing politician, or vice versa, and they'll flip. The exact same policy, they'll love it if it came from their side and hate it if it came from the other side. So to be cognizant of that, choose spokesmen with care. I've heard it said that one of the worst things that ever happened to the climate movement was when Al Gore put out An Inconvenient Truth and gave it a kind of a left-wing brand, which it didn't as much have before. So that's one of it. And there are people do have intuitions of purity and contamination that can often lead to irrationalities, but have to be taken into account. And to get people into a kind of cost-benefit mindset, it isn't easy, because that often will seem to be taboo if it challenges sacred values. But it is, at least for some people, it's something they can get to. I mean, the most kind of in-your-face way of putting it from the economist Robert Frank is, there's an optimal amount of pollution in the environment, just like there's an optimal amount of dirt in your house. Now, that's almost a taboo. I don't advise that you lead with that statement. But if if that's a guaranteed loser, but if you can get people around to it kind of obliquely, that it doesn't make sense to spend infinite amounts of money to remove the last infinitesimal fraction of a pollutant with no effects on human health. If people can get into that pragmatic mindset, but mindful of the fact that that is a heavy lift, that people do often think of purity and contamination and sacredness. But that's just sort of what we're up against.
Right. Well, Stephen, thanks so much. I'm going to go off and listen to this Tom Lehrer song.
You must. Yes.
Yeah, you've been our inaugural guest on this podcast, and so it's really been fantastic to have you. And thanks so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me, and good luck in your efforts.
Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list, and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.